Hi, everyone. Welcome to this training session, and thanks for joining us. I want to start by saying sorry for having to reschedule this session, but if you're here, I'm really glad you made it. I'm just going to start by introducing myself. My name is Miruna. I am the Customer Support and Success Specialist here at Sitebulb. So you'll see me in the support inbox, and I run these regular training sessions. We have one a month at the moment. Throughout the session, please do feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, and you will receive a recording of the session right after we're done today. So I wanted to start by defining today's session, and hopefully anyone that's a little bit late will join us by the time I start the demo. Our aim today is to kind of talk you through our tips and tricks on how to set up fast and efficient website audits. And we're going to specifically talk through how to set up sample audits, how to analyze the data and then draw conclusions to adjust and choose the correct crawl settings for your large crawls. I've got a message saying you can't hear me. Can everyone else hear me? Can someone just give me a thumbs up or thumbs down in the chat? Okay. So there might be, there might be an issue on some of our users' end, but everyone else seems to be able to hear me. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so like I said, our main takeaways are going to be running sample audits, adjusting the scope and settings of your large audits. And I'm also going to briefly touch on how to manage your resources on both desktop and cloud. But let's get started. Right, so the first question is, what is a large website, right? Now, size is very subjective. Obviously, it depends on the size of your team, the type of clients that you're working with. For some people, anything over 10,000 URLs might be a large website, especially if you're working on your own or if you're an in-house marketer. In other cases, you might deal with websites that are millions and millions of URLs if you're working on a marketplace or an e-commerce site. So it's all relative, but what we're talking about specifically here is websites that are over 100,000 URLs, and we're drawing that limit for practical purposes, because when you're going over the limit of 100,000 URLs, you're starting to think about how long it's going to take you to run that crawl and what kind of resources you're going to need. So it starts being really worth it to think about your crawls setup before you start running it. Some things to also consider is that even if your website only has, a couple 100,000 URLs, you have to think about everything that Sitebulb collects. So that includes internal URLs, external URLs, subdomains, parameterized URLs. So that could be like all of the different dynamic URLs that your site creates, and page resources. So your final audit can potentially be much, much larger than just the total number of indexable URLs or pages on your website. So before you start running a large crawl, there are a few considerations that I want you to take into account. The first of them being your Sitebulb plan. So obviously this is quite basic, and at the time of choosing your subscription, you've probably already thought about this. But the idea behind it is that different Sitebulb plans will have, one of the only hard limits that we have is the number of URLs per audit. And that's going to impact the size of the websites you can crawl, or potentially it's just going to mean that you need to set up your audits differently. So you might need to chunk up your website into different directories in order to be able to run audits for a larger website. So just something to think about. The next thing, obviously, most importantly, is the size of your website. Now, when it comes to the size of your website, there will be occasions where you clearly know what the size of your website is. Say, if you have access to tools like Google Search Console, you might have a clear idea However, if you're dealing with a brand new client or you're trying to put together a proposal for a potential client, you might simply not know. So this is when you can use tools like Google's site search, put your URL through Google and try and see how many indexed URLs there are. Obviously, that's just going to be an estimation, but even if it's an estimation, it's good to have that idea. So once you run your sample crawl, you know how much you need to scale while you're seeing your sample crawl when you're actually running your final audit. And finally, and this is important no matter the size of your website, but obviously it becomes very, very important when you're dealing with large websites, is what data do you need? Every extra report that you turn on, and I know it's tempting to turn on every single report and crawl every single URL. SEOs love data, right? We know that. But every single report you turn on is going to add on extra time to your audit, is going to add on extra processing time. And there might be things that you simply don't need. Also, Sitebulb allows you to run unlimited number of audits and projects. So you can always consider, creating different projects for different purposes. You might run performance, for example, on just your key pages or a section of your site, and you might run, a general SEO crawl on the full site. You need to think about those things before you set up your projects and audits. So you're about to run a large website. You know more or less the size of the site and what to expect. And you know what you're trying to achieve with your audit. The next step that we recommend that you do is run a sample audit. So the first thing is, I want to briefly touch on why run a sample audit. The idea behind the sample audit is that you're going to have a small number of URLs that are going to reveal an idea about what data you're going to collect with your settings, with the settings that you've decided for your final crawl. It's going to help you identify potential bloat. So especially if you're dealing with e-commerce websites, you're going to have things like parameterized URLs, faceted navigation, page resources, non-indexable URLs, external subdomains, etc. There can be loads of different URLs other than your key pages Sitebulb might collect that you do not need, and it's going to add crawl time. It's going to take longer to get your data, and then it's going to mean that you need to filter through that data and do more work to find key insights. So that's what we're trying to avoid. And finally, we are trying to avoid long or failed audits. So the idea here is that you're going to run a sample audit for 5,000 URLs, for example. And if anything goes wrong, if your pages don't render correctly, if you need to adjust your settings, you'll know at that point, rather than running, several million URLs, which might take a day, a couple of days, and then finding out that the data is not actually useful to you. In terms of sample audits, I'm going to now talk you through how to set them up, how to monitor progress and analyze the data, and how to then apply all of that to setting up your large crawl. Okay, so actually, this is an example of a crawl in progress, but I'm just going to move on to our demonstration. If you're struggling to see this, I would recommend making your view full screen, which you can do at the top right, just on the left of the chat. So you hopefully can see this a bit better. I can also zoom in for you. What I'm using here is Sitebulb Cloud. So it's our cloud crawler. You can access it through the browser, and obviously it doesn't depend on your computer resources. So usually if you're regularly dealing with large websites, this is the solution that will be most adequate for you. But what I'm about to show you applies to both desktop and cloud. Okay, so let's start a new project. At this point, you know the website you want to crawl, and you've got a clear idea of what you're trying to achieve. So you've got an idea of the settings you might want to apply to your final audit. What you are going to do is start a new project and name it. I like to give it the sample name just so you can identify it later. and you will create a new project for your final audit. I'm using the BBC here just because it is a huge site. We know it's a huge site and it's a good example. And what you're going to do at this point is change the audit type to sample. Once you do that, you've got two extra options that appear here, which allow you to essentially control the breadth and depth of the crawl. So the first metric is the maximum sample URLs per depth, and the second is the maximum sample crawl depth. When we talk about crawl depth in Sitebulb, we're talking about the maximum number of page levels that Sitebulb will crawl on your site, like within your site hierarchy, where the homepage is level 0, and then every link followed from the homepage is on level 1, and so on. So then every link followed from there is on level 2. So you're essentially measuring how many hops or links Sitebulb needs to follow to reach a certain URL. That's your page depth. So in this case, what we're saying is for each crawl depth, crawl this number of URLs. What we would recommend, obviously, again, this depends on how big you want your sample audit to be, how much time you have, but something like 500 URLs per depth and 10 crawl depth will give you a good example, a good sample of what's going on your website. Another thing I want to clarify here just briefly is if we go into any other audit, actually, let me take you to just a general audit, like one of our normal full website audits. So if we go to edit settings and schedule, if you've used Sitebulb before and you're probably familiar with the maximum URLs to audit. I just want to clarify that there's a difference here. And you should be aiming to run a sample audit, because when you run a sample audit, you've got this URLs per depth and depth metrics. While if I was to just set a maximum URLs per audit limit, if you're dealing with a huge site, you might have like, hundreds, thousands, millions of URLs at depth 1, and you might be using up your crawl limit on depth 1, and actually the problems, the parameterized URLs, all of those things that you want to avoid on your final crawl might be deeper in your website structure. So that's why using this specific sample audit settings is really important. So I've chosen my sample audit. I might want to choose the Chrome crawler here. I'm going to click Save and Continue and move on to my audit settings. Now, when you get to your audit settings, what you're going to want to do is set up this audit as you're intending to set up your final audit, so you have a clear idea of what it might return. In this case, I might recommend doing things like enabling page resources. Is that something that you're going to do on your final audit? Just follow the same process that you would at that point. If you're unsure about what settings to choose, say if this is a brand new website that you're crawling or you're not very familiar with Sitebulb, we do have some recommendations. So you can access our help center here. And we have an article on choosing the right settings for efficient auditing, and this can help you figure that out. And we've also got an article on using single page analysis to figure out website audit settings that can also be really helpful. So I'm just going to turn those two on and click Start Now to talk you through the next step of this process. So once you've chosen your audit settings, you've chosen those sample audit limits that you want to run, you're going to let Sitebulb run your audit, and you're going to pay a little bit of attention to this progress screen. I'm not saying that you have to sit here and look at it until it completes, but you might just want to check back in every few minutes, say, to see what is happening with your audit, because it can give you really useful information. So the first thing you want to look at is your average speed. In this case, obviously, I've just used Sitebulb's default settings, and I can see that Sitebulb is able to crawl quite quickly. This might be an acceptable crawl speed, I would say. But if the crawl is going particularly slow, or perhaps going too fast, you can adjust those settings here. So that's the first thing you want to look at. The next thing you want to look at is the type of URLs that are being pulled through. So again, if you're dealing with paginated URLs, if you're dealing with lots of faceted navigation, you will most likely see that coming through here. You'll see those parameterized URLs starting to pop up, and it'll give you an idea of what the crawl is collecting. And then finally, I recommend that you keep an eye on these top metrics. Again, if the crawl is running too fast, for example, for your server to handle, and you haven't whitelisted Sitebulb, you will most likely start to see forbidden and errors pop up, and this metric going up and up. That's a clear sign that something's not right. At that point, you might as well either pause or stop the crawl and reassess what you need to do, right? So if you're seeing 403 messages coming up, and you know you've got an authorization issue, then you need to go and whitelist Sitebulb before you can continue. If you're seeing errors, you might want to let the crawl finish and then analyze those errors and see why they're popping up. Great. So you have chosen your audit settings, you've set up your sample crawl, you've monitored the progress. The next thing you're going to have is a finalized sample audit. And we're going to move on to analyzing that data. So this is the crawl that I had just set up. It's just a finalized version of that audit. And I'm going to talk you through what we're looking at here. First of all, you can see the number of internal URLs is 3.7. That limit that you're setting is strictly applied to HTML URLs, which means things like resources and resources particularly are not going to contribute to the limit, because obviously that would immensely blow the crawl and it would stop really, really soon. It's crawled 3.7 internal, 400, nearly 500 external URLs. So it stopped somewhere around 4.3, 4.4. It didn't quite hit that 5,000 URLs limit, but it got close. And straight off the bat, what I can see is that there's a huge number of resources on this website. So there isn't a huge number of external URLs, but there is a huge number of resources. Like I said before, if I know that there are, I think there's around 300 million index pages for the BBC website based on site search. And there's somewhere between 6 or 7 resources for every HTML URL, right? So we've got 3.7 internal, 22,000 resources. Then I know that looking at the number of indexed URLs I can see in Google, I need to multiply that by 6 or 7 at least if I'm going to crawl every single resource on the site. So that already gives me an idea of, the size of that final audit. Like I said, I'm also looking at external. And next thing I might want to do is move on to the indexability tab and see the ratio of indexable to non-indexable URLs. So in this case, it's actually pretty normal. It's nothing that I would be particularly worried about. There's 60 non-indexable URLs against the 3,400 indexable URLs that Sitebulb crawled. But you might come across websites where you've got, 1-to-1 ratio of indexed and non-indexed URLs. And in that case, again, that if you know how many indexable URLs there are on the site, you can expect to double that just by crawling non-indexable URLs. The next thing that you can do looking at external URLs is consider subdomains. So by default, Sitebulb will treat subdomains just like it treats external URLs, which essentially means it'll just check their HTTP status. But again, you might want to consider the number of external URLs crawled and whether or not those are relevant to you, and how many of those are subdomains and whether or not those are relevant to you. The next thing I would recommend doing is going to your internal URLs and having a quick look at the type of pages that Sitebulb has managed to crawl. So you can obviously do this by looking at your URL list and using the add remove columns and the advanced filter to see whether key pages have been found and what kind of pages have been found. You can also use the URL Explorer and use these pre-filtered tabs to kind of understand the breakdown of HTML, the type of downloads, the type of redirected canonicalized pages, etc. And in the case of parameters URLs, obviously you might have already seen them during that processing stage. Within the internal report, we've also got dedicated hints that will flag up things like URLs containing question mark and URLs containing parameters, right? So in this case, Sitebulb is telling me that out of the nearly 4,000 URL crawls, about 10% were paginated. So I might want to view these URLs and kind of consider whether or not they are relevant to me and if they're providing useful information, right? So even things like, are they indexable? Are they not indexable? Are they canonicalized? Like, what is going on here? And are they relevant to my final crawl? So this is a perfect example of something that we might not want to include in our final crawl because it's going to add at least 10% extra of that. The amount of URLs that we need to crawl is going to add crawl time, and it's not going to be valuable potentially when it comes to analyzing the final data. Okay, so you have looked at these things. Actually, there's one more thing that I want to talk to you about, which is as you go through your crawl, I recommend that you dedicate a moment to understand whether the data that Sitebulb is returning seems accurate. So you might want to look at this distribution here of errors to successful URLs. Have there been any forbidden or error messages that you didn't expect? And I would also recommend that you do like a quick checkup of key pages. So I might want to go to, say, this page, view it, and look at things like the indexability and the on-page elements, and understand whether the data here is what I expect it to be and is complete. Now, in most cases, the data is going to be accurate, right? But what we have seen is that, especially when it comes to large websites, sometimes you do have complex setups, which is going to mean that you run against rendering issues occasionally. You might run against Cloudflare, stopping Sitebulb from crawling the website or rendering it properly. You might need to authenticate, or you might just need to adjust your Chrome crawler settings in order to be able to correctly crawl the pages and render the content. So just have a look at that in order to avoid a full crawl where data is missing because the crawl settings weren't quite what you needed them to be. And again, if you go navigate to the Help Center, we do have an article on using the single page analysis tool to troubleshoot audit settings. So if you are finding that your pages are not rendering as you expect them to, this is how you can troubleshoot that and find the correct Chrome crawler settings. Again, specifically useful for JavaScript websites. Right, so you've drawn some conclusions now about what data is useful to you. What you need to do is go back to your crawl settings and adjust them. So the key things that you would usually be adjusting are this as follows. First of all, external link analysis. Do you want external links included in your crawl? If you're dealing with a massive website and you're trying to crawl faster and get your internal page data more efficiently, you might not want to crawl external links. So you can disable that here. Similarly, like I said, subdomains are crawled by default and their HTTP status is crawled, but you do have the option to either exclude them, so not crawl them at all, or even audit them as internal and set rules for which subdomains you want to audit and which ones you don't. The next thing is page resources. So in this case, I did enable them at the start because I knew I wanted to audit my page resources. You do have the option to use advanced settings and determine which page resources will be collected. The only caveat here is that obviously if you enable performance, Sitebulb will need to crawl every single page resource in order to be able to give you accurate data. The next thing is including and excluding URLs. So based on the data that you've collected on your audit, you can now determine, are there any areas of your site that you do not want to crawl? For example, are there blog category pages that are canonicalized and are not relevant to you and you want to exclude? You can also limit your crawl to a very specific area of the site by using the URL inclusions. And more importantly, if you're dealing with e-commerce, marketplace, faceted navigation, you can choose to not crawl parameters. So excluding parameterized URLs tends to be one of the biggest efficiency tips when you're dealing with large e-commerce websites, but you can include safe query string parameters. So if there's specific parameterized URLs that you do want included in your crawl, but you don't want to crawl everything, this is how you do that. Right. There are obviously other settings that you might want to adjust once you've analyzed the accuracy of your data, but that tends to be very specific website, case by case examples. So I just have a couple more tips to give you. I don't know if we might want to look at Q&A just in a moment. But my final tips are considering resources and time. So like I said, generally, we do recommend that you use, here we are. We do recommend that you use cloud if you're going to crawl large websites regularly, because obviously you do have advantages. And the main advantage is that Sitebulb is not running on your local machine, which means it can run continuously and it can run at any point. You can schedule your audits, for example, to start running over the weekend. So you have data when you come back on Monday. You can run your audits overnight to ensure that you're not, overusing the server during like your peak times. So there are, different advantages there. And it's also the fact that all of your team can access one point of centralized data rather than having to run the same audit and wait for that data on different machines. Now, if you are running on desktop, you need to take into account the fact that the last thing you want to do is unexpected crawl interruptions, which might alter your data and cause errors. So Sitebulb needs to be open and your machine has to be on if you're crawling on Sitebulb desktop, which means that if you are about to leave the office for the day, you will want to pause your crawl in order to have a controlled stop of your audit. So you can pause your crawl, and then when you come back into the office next morning and you reopen your computer, you can resume and let that crawl run again. Again, something that you could avoid by using cloud. So it's just that consideration of what is your day-to-day and how often do you need to crawl these large websites. Okay, so that is what I want to go through. I will send you some links to the resources I have mentioned in the email with the recording. But I'm just going to take a couple of minutes and see if there are any questions. Let's have a look. How long would it take? I don't know if anyone can see this question. How long would it take to crawl a 100,000 page site roughly? Okay, so that is a good question. However, I cannot answer that for you because how long it will take to crawl your site and crawl 100,000 pages will depend on a variety of factors. First of all, the speed of your site. So you can see here on the right-hand side, the time to first byte. on the case of this example website, the BBC, the pages load quite fast. But then on top of that time to first byte, you have to add all of the processing time for all of the different reports that you have enabled. So, that will massively depend on your crawl settings. In some cases, if you have enabled things like accessibility, spelling, performance, that all adds processing time for each URL. So we will add to the crawl time. You also have the option, obviously, to manage your crawl speed settings. So how many instances of Chrome and URLs per second you're crawling. So that will all affect the speed of the final crawl. And how fast you can crawl will depend on what your server can handle. Some servers cannot handle speed at all. Some website servers, you can hammer them and they will respond correctly every time. So yeah, it does highly depend on your crawl settings and your website. Okay, is it possible to integrate through APIs, Chat, GPT, Gemini analysis? So at the moment, we do not have any AI, ChatGPT integrations, anything like that. If you do have any specific feature requests, we're always open to them. You can email support@sitebulb.com, give us a kind of a breakdown of your case study, what is that you would like to use it for, and we can always consider new features. There is another question here about APIs. So what you can do with Sitebulb are things like webhooks to be notified when your crawl starts and to be notified of different stages of the crawl. We also have the option to automatically export data into sheets, as well as integrating with Looker Studio, which I don't know if I can show you from here. Here we go. You can enable Looker Studio access and automatically pull data into Looker Studio and do technical SEO reporting onto Looker Studio dashboard that way. So that's kind of like the outside data integrations that we have available at the moment. And then for the custom and large plans, we have recently added some new integrations that work with data warehousing and kind of managing your data elsewhere. But I do recommend that if you're interested in that and that size, you kind of have a chat with us. Cool. I don't think there are any other questions in the Q&A. And nothing else in the chat. So we're going to leave it here for now. Thank you very much for attending. And like I said, I will be in touch with the recording and some resources. If there's anything else that you need support with, just contact us at support@sitebulb.com, or even better, message us directly through the tool so you can have us just here helping you with your audit settings. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.